Hello and welcome to Unity Presbyterian Church Online. This week in worship, Pastor David takes a look at the prophet Hosea and the relentless love of God. Let's listen.
There are certain phrases that I heard from my mom growing up that I bet you heard from your mom too. They're almost the universal mom sayings. Sayings like, just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean that you should be doing it too. Or sayings like, I'm not saying this to be mean, it's just that I care about you. Or, clean your room, I'm not a maid, there's no maid service around here. Or maybe this last one, I bet you've heard before, don't fill up on snacks because you'll ruin your what? Your dinner. You'll ruin your dinner. Now I wonder, did you ever disobey that particular advice? I mean, perhaps you snuck a bag of Doritos or a thing of Chips Ahoy and you just kind of gorged yourself to your heart's delight. And then 30 minutes later, there was dinner. And you found yourself like, oh, I'm not really feeling very good. What I ate was not really satisfying for me, and I don't feel good. And now that we have the actual dinner that should nourish my body, I'm not hungry. I'm not ready to eat this. And then in the back of your head, there's that little whisper that says, see, your mom was right. And you never say that out loud. You never admit that, but you understood why your mom said the things that she did. You see, sometimes we fill up on things that taste good in the moment, but they leave us empty when it matters most. And that's what the story in the Bible is going to share with us today. We're going to learn about a group of people who kept choosing what looked good instead of what would actually bring them life. So today, we are following the minor prophets. It's week 3 in our series, Minor Prophet, Major Impact. And today's minor prophet is Hosea. And God is going to ask Hosea to do something almost unimaginably difficult. God tells Hosea to marry a woman that he knows is going to be unfaithful to him. So before he says his wedding vows, before he commits his heart to her, before he says, I do, he knows that her heart is going to wander away from him. So why does God ask Hosea to do something so incredibly challenging and frankly disturbing from Hosea? Well, to the people that this was written to 3,000 years ago, this would not have sounded as unusual as it does to our modern ears, because the prophets lived back in this time period. We don't have prophets in the same way, but the prophets who God would deliver God's message through would often do outlandish things in order to capture the people's attention. And once the prophets captured their attention, it was then that God would speak the message through them. For instance, Isaiah once was told to walk around barefoot and naked for 3 years throughout Jerusalem as a way of showing the people what it would be like when they were taken into captivity and the humiliation that they would feel. Or there was Jeremiah. And Jeremiah had a heavy wooden chest that he carried around with him to show the burden that God's people were going to have once Babylon took over. So they would do these outlandish things, capture people's attention, and then they would say, this is what God has to say to you in this moment. So that's exactly what is happening in the story of Hosea. God intends to teach God's people something absolutely life-changing through this story. And that includes us, the people who are hearing it today. So here's how the story begins, chapter 1, verse 2. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. Now, if I were this prophet, I might do my best Jonah impression. I might find the nearest boat and just head in the opposite direction. Or I might put my fingers in my ears and just pretend that I did not hear from God. But remember, God wants to get the people's attention. And when God has their attention, this is the principle that God intends to teach them. The verse goes on. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So this is what's happening here. Just like Gomer is unfaithful to Hosea, God's people have been unfaithful to God. So when God gave God's people the 10 Commandments, when he called them out of slavery and said, this is who you are to be, one of those commandments was that they were to worship God and God alone, that their sole allegiance in their heart was only to be to God. But by the time Hosea speaks, it's 500 years later, and they have reneged on that promise. Now, if you continue to read through this book, which again, I encourage you to do this week, it's full of good wisdom, what you'll find are what I think are the three main examples of the ways that God's people, how their hearts had wandered from God. Now, what I don't want this to be is just an interesting kind of historical study to say, oh, this is how the people were back then. No, I think in each one of these examples, we can probably relate to it some way today for us as well. And so as we study how God's people kind of wandered from God 3,000 years ago, apply it to yourself today as well. To say, okay, where do I do that? Where do I struggle with that? Here's the first one. It's from chapter 5, verse 4. God says, a spirit of infidelity is in their heart. They do not acknowledge the Lord. So the first way that they've wandered away from God is that their hearts are not right before God. What this is strongly implying is that infidelity does not begin in the act itself. It always begins long before that in the heart and in the mind. And the same is true when people wander from God. The wandering doesn't happen all at once in a moment. It happens over a long stretch of time. I had a conversation with my roommate, for example, back in college. And we were both Christians. It was Presbyterian college, after all. And we were excited to room together. We had many good conversations about faith. And then, I think as the semester started, a whole group of friends and I, we were going to try out different churches and decide where we wanted to commit to that year. So I invited my roommate to come along, and he said no, he'd rather sleep in, which, hey, it's college, totally respect that, totally get that. But throughout that whole first semester, I kept inviting him to things. Hey, our church is doing this group is doing this. And every time, no, I'm too busy, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that. It was at the end of our second semester that we were cooking dinner together. And I put cooking in quotations because it's college. I think I was making ramen or maybe pouring a bowl of cereal and calling that cooking. But we were cooking dinner together. And he called me aside. And he said, hey David, I want to talk to you for a second. I said, oh, okay, what's going on? And he said, I don't think I believe in God anymore. And I was kind of shocked at that. And I said, okay, well, tell me more about that. And I'll never forget what he said. He just shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't know why. I think I've just kind of drifted. And I think that's how it happens. We don't turn from God in a moment. We drift slowly, day by day, decision by decision. When Hosea speaks about a heart of infidelity towards God, this is what he's talking about. That the slow drift can take root in us. I think a challenging truth of the spiritual life is that it's incredibly hard to stay neutral. You're either actively pursuing God and growing in your faith towards God, or you're kind of drifting away. To stay in one place like you're treading water is very, very difficult to do. Unfaithfulness is not usually a loud act of rebellion towards God. It's often that quiet misdirection over and over. And so that's the first way that God noticed that God's people were moving away from him. It started in their hearts. And then here's the second way that he talks about in Hosea. Now in chapter 12, God says the merchant uses dishonest scales and loves to defraud. Ephraim boasts, I am very rich. I have become wealthy, and with all my wealth, they will not find in me any iniquity or sin. So the people's hearts had drifted from God, and it is now showing itself through their actions. Now, in the ancient marketplace, merchants would use scales and weights to measure goods. We've got a picture of that to describe what that would feel like to kind of put yourself back in that moment. But if you tampered with those weights, you could charge something more than it was worth, or you could take advantage of someone by giving them less than what they paid for. So what Hosea is saying here is that when you tampered with these things, this was not an example of occasional dishonesty. No, dishonesty was built into the very fabric of your business. They had adopted almost a normalized dishonesty. So not only had they normalized it, but then they convinced themselves that what they were doing was right. I wonder if you noticed their boast at the end there. Their boast was to say, well, look at how well I've done. Yeah, I have all this wealth, so surely there's nothing wrong in my heart. Surely I'm heading in the right direction. So the people had drifted, and their whole then economic system had drifted as well. And then here's the last way that they really became unfaithful to God. Chapter 13. God says, now they sin more and more. They make idols for themselves from their silver, cleverly fashioned images, all of them the work of a craftsman. It is said of these people, they often offer human sacrifices. They kiss calf idols. So notice the evolution that we've seen of God's people so far in Hosea. The corruption started in their hearts as they drifted away from God. That corruption then was acted out in how they created their culture of dishonesty. And by chapter 13, they have now replaced God with their own man-made gods. So rather than following God, who may not like what they are doing, they make up their own gods who will have no judgment on their actions. You see, when they did this, when they created their own gods, they threw out the whole moral code of the 10 Commandments. And this led to some extremely disturbing practices during this time period. I wonder if you noticed it. One of those practices was human sacrifice. Now, we know historically that this was done and was fairly common in the countries surrounding Israel around the time of Hosea. Unfortunately, what we see is that it often or also happened in Israel. It happened during the time of Hosea. So no wonder God was so upset with the people. I mean, rather than lift everybody up as people made in the very image of God, they have now dehumanized one another so much that they're willing to offer sacrifice to gods that are not even real. So what is God to do? Facing this situation, over the course of 500 years, about how far the people have drifted, what is God to do? I mean, they've been unfaithful to God, right? So God has every right just to wash his hands of them, just to move on to a different people group, right? This is where the story of Hosea becomes really interesting. Back to chapter 3 for a second. So the Lord said to me, go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. God wants Hosea to return to his wife. Even though he has been rejected, God commands him to show love to her once more. Now, allow me to interject just for a moment to say that if you've been a part of an unfaithful relationship, I'm so sorry for the pain that you have experienced through that. Please don't take this story as a command of what to do in your own unique situation. Instead, remember, this story is meant to illustrate what God chooses to do with us when we wander away from God. That's the focus of the text. And that's exactly what God says to Hosea next. Chapter 3 goes on, the first verse. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. Okay, I think we need to point out the obvious here before we move on. What does God have against sacred raisin cakes? I mean, I can't move past that. As I was reading this week, I paused at that and said, okay, there's more to that story. There's there's something happening here. And as I researched it, I found out that what made the raisin cakes sacred is that they were offered to different gods, particularly the gods of fertility and the gods of agriculture. And so it's like God is saying, no, put all that away. All the things that you used to please other gods that were not me, it's time to set that aside. So we can set aside the raisin cakes for a moment. The heart of what God is saying here to Hosea is that God tells Hosea to return to Gomer, even though she has betrayed him. And in the same way, God is going to return to God's people, even though they have turned to other gods. So the main message of this story is that God will be faithful to a people who has been unfaithful. So apply that to us for a second. When someone declares in their heart, I have given up on God, like my roommate did so many years ago, I envision God saying right back to them, well, I have not given up on you. When the prodigal son wanders away, what does God do? God waits there with open arms, ready for that son to return. God's relentless love is described throughout the book of Hosea. Yes, God is saying, I'm going to be honest with how bad things have gotten, with how challenging it is, but that does not change my love, the love that I have for you. Now, I think one of the most striking things about this is the way it's described a little bit later on when God describes God's love as like a parent. So on this Mother's Day, I found this section to be especially fitting from chapter 11. God says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt, I called my son. It was I who taught them to walk, taking them by the arms. But they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them, I was like the one who lifts a little child to the cheek, and I bent down to feed them. God is describing a parent teaching their child to walk. And if you've ever done that before in your own life, you know that's a holy moment, isn't it? And you also know that that child learning to walk, it doesn't happen right away. I mean, when that child comes in to the world, they can't even support their head, right? You have to care for them, hold them. They depend on you completely. And then they have to learn things before they get to that time of walking. A child has to learn how to roll over first, right? That's the first step. And then they kind of scoot around a little bit. And then eventually they start crawling. But even then, they don't go from crawling to walking. First, they pull up, right? And they start pulling up on everything and get kind of the standing down. And then they're ready to try that first step. And that parent is there with open arms, just ready to receive that child. And when that child falls, as it inevitably will, that parent with the same arms will be there to pick that child up. This is the image that God gives us of how God acts with us. This is how God views you, like a child, that God has taught how to live this life. God has taught us everything, how to live, how to love, how to learn. And God has picked us up when we have fallen. And so on this Mother's Day, we celebrate all the different ways that this kind of love shows up in the world through teaching, through guiding, through caring, through sacrificing, often in ways that go unnoticed. I don't think it's a mistake that God chose this image to share God's love with us today. This passage also described God picking up a child and bringing that child up to God's cheek. And I just thought, what an absolutely beautiful and an intimate picture of God. There's such tenderness in that image, isn't there? Such closeness and care. It makes me think when my first child was born. That was 13 years ago now, and we did a little newborn photo shoot around our neighborhood, and there's this one picture that has always really stuck with me, that I've really enjoyed, that I wanted to share with you. In this picture, in this photo shoot, one, I look a lot younger than I do now. Amazing what 13 years can do. But I also look at this image, and I look at Zoe. She was 2 months old there, and she was so small, and she was so fragile, and she depended on us for everything. She's 13 now, and so don't tell her I said this. She's off with her programming now, but she's full teenager at this point, right? She thinks she's completely self-sufficient, not dependent on us for anything. And Sarah and I, we had no idea what it was going to be like to raise that child in that moment. She was our firstborn. But I imagine that when we're looking at each other, it didn't matter. It didn't matter what was going to come, the ups or the downs, the adventures of raising this child. We just knew that God had placed her into our lives, and we were going to do the best job we could loving her each and every day. If that's the kind of love I have for my child, can you imagine the type of love that God has for you? Because you are God's child as well. I mean, there's nothing my daughter could do that would make me love her any less. And in the same way, I believe there's nothing you can do. There's no distance that you could wander that would make God love you any less either. And yet, how often do we live as if God's love for us rises and falls depending on our own performance or behavior? I mean, there are times that we fall back into an old habit and we think to ourselves, how is God thinking of me now? We're disappointed in ourselves and we just assume God must be disappointed in us too. When those kind of thoughts begin to intrude, I want you to remember this image that came from Hosea. This image of God teaching a child to walk. God looking at you with those same eyes of love, because that's how God sees us. It reminds me of when a child comes home from school. Maybe you've had this before. And that child comes home and it's report card day, and they're avoiding eye contact. And so you know this is not a good thing. And they give you the report card and it's bad. Not just one class, but a whole bunch of classes. And what might that child be thinking in that moment? They might be thinking, okay, my parents not only mad at me, maybe they love me a little bit less. You know, maybe there's something based on my performance that has disappointed them so much that they view me differently. And yet what's happening in the mind of a parent? The parent's thinking, well, obviously I want what's best for my child. Obviously I'm going to work with them to achieve what I know they can, but your love, it hasn't moved an inch, has it? It hasn't changed in the slightest. That's the sort of love, that relentless love that Hosea uses for God. When God is presented in this chapter, in this book, what we see is that God's love is not fragile. It doesn't fade when we wander. It doesn't shrink when we struggle. It doesn't weaken when we fail. It stays, always. And so that's the image that I want you to take with you today on this Mother's Day, is when you see love in your life, when you share love with others, remember this relentless staying power of love that God also has for you. Experience that. Embrace that today. Amen.
If you would like more information about Unity Presbyterian Church, please visit our website at www.unitypres.org or visit us on Facebook. This is the Unity Presbyterian Church podcast. Have a great week.